Today's January 12th, 2022. My name is Adolfo Romero.
And my name is Vasilios Kosmakos.
And today we have the pleasure to be with Captain Doug Stamm, and which he will be discussing a little bit about the natural history collection that we have going on, but developing a little bit more on it based off on the experiences that you had. So to begin with, one of our first questions, we usually like to start with introductions. Where were you born, raised, and maybe just a little bit about background information about your family.
Okay, well, I was born in Iowa, and I grew up there as a child. And when I was in high school, I moved to southern Wisconsin. My father was an educator and a member of Wisconsin's Department of Public Instruction. And accordingly, when I was 16, he was given a job offer for the summer at the University of Nova Scotia. I was a landlocked kid. I spent a lot of time around water and creeks and lakes, but I was always fascinated by them, but they were always opaque, green, and cold. And when I was 16, my father took me to Nova Scotia, and I got my first face mask and my first snorkel and fins. And to this day, and it gives me goosebumps to talk about it, I entered the water and a whole new, unbelievable, beautiful world was there in front of me. I had never seen before or thought of before. And that day changed my life. So from there on, after, all I ever wanted to do was to learn more about what's under the surface. So when I was in college, I was a major in biology. I was a certified scuba diver in 1965, which is one of the earlier times people were certified. I spent my youth diving in streams, lakes, ponds, creeks, rivers. Wherever there was water, I was in it, and with a camera. And a friend of mine at the University of Florida said, "Doug, you need to come to Florida. We have something here that I think you should see." So I went to Florida in the early 70s with him. His father was a professor of chemistry at FSU. And he took me to some springs, particularly Peacock. And I was just so amazed that I'm still amazed at the clarity. Being a biologist, you can see all of the principles of freshwater biology play out before your very eyes. Just because the water is so clear, you can just see everything that you always were taught and that you can't see in most the realms of fresh water. So after that, I thought the world should know these places better. I had been a diver biologist with the University of Wisconsin and had published a book on the northern lakes of the Midwest, which are quite clear, but they weren't anything compared to the springs of Florida. So I just made it my personal choice to decide to document the springs as best I could. And I started that in 1973.
Okay, can you tell me which university did you ended up attending? Was it in Florida or outside of Florida?
I went to the University of Wisconsin. I graduated from there in wildlife ecology. I worked at the Laboratory of Limnology for several years and then moved on to the Marine Studies Center, which did specific work in the Great Lakes. I was a chief diver biologist with the Marine Studies Center for 5 years. We spent a lot of time underwater working in the Great Lakes, specifically trying to rehabilitate lake trout that were extinct from overfishing in the sea lamprey. So once I saw Florida, though, my life changed.
And how did you end up in Florida?
Well, I ended up in Florida because my friend at FSU said, "You need to see these springs." I'd already published a small book published by the University of Wisconsin Press, first book of its kind ever of underwater freshwater photography, and I identified the ecosystem and the inhabitants, similar to what I did in the Springs of Florida book. But as you know, if you've ever put your face mask below the surface of the water, there's no comparable freshwater world than the springs of Florida. So I just have never stopped doing that.
And
That's
would you
been
mind
45 years, my friends.
And would you mind speaking about exactly what makes Florida Springs unique compared to stuff like the Great Lakes or
Well,
really any?
they're unique to me because, as I said, they're crystal clear, they're vibrant with life, they're full of life, and everything you've ever learned about biology is there before your very eyes. You don't need to read about it. You can see it happening in front of you. And the springs of Florida are extremely rare in the world. There's no other place like North Florida anywhere in the world that has the numbers and the size of these springs that literally rise to the surface of the land from our huge aquifer beneath, beneath our state. And when those rise to the land, water is so clear, sunlight goes deep, it just creates a magnificent ecosystem because light can travel further into the water, create photosynthesis. That's the basis of life. And the springs of Florida are just resplendent with life. And I wanted to document that.
All right. I would like to move on a little bit to understand more the springs, the aquifers over the years. What has been your experience compared to now? Have you seen like a depletion in water levels in the springs, even the clarity of the water in those springs from when you first started, 40 years ago, 45 years ago till now? Have you seen any difference, or some areas have been affected or some areas are still the same? What's your experience?
I have seen both. Gentlemen, I've seen tremendous degradation in some of the springs that are in urban areas. And I'll give you a couple examples. Crystal River is the historic wintering grounds of the Florida manatee. They've been around long before Europeans ever came to Florida. Crystal River represents the farthest, most northern natural range of the manatee in winter. It was crystal clear in the 70s. It was full of life, thousands of fish in the main springs, resplendent with eelgrass, which is the big food for manatees. And I can document that in the earlier photos from my book. And then slowly, ever so slowly, because Crystal River is a small city, nitrates from fertilizer, septic tanks, and over-fertilization of lawns and farm fields started to put nitrates into the aquifer. The aquifer is the source not only of the springs, but of the water people drink. And what was happening was nitrates are fertilizer. It entered the springs, it over-fertilized the springs, clouded the water, the eelgrass died. Here's one good example. In 1978, when I dove in the main big King Spring in Crystal River, I could see 1,000 fish at a time. I could see 100 feet across the main spring. The water was crystal clear. 5 years ago, gentlemen, when I was there, I could not see my hand in front of my face. The water was so green and foul. What's happened was the nitrates created the pollution, and overpumping created the lesser flow such that the spring river couldn't really vent itself. The tide would come in, the tide would go out, but the flow was so decreased that it just didn't flush the system as it originally had. So tremendous degradation of a very historic and important site. This last month, I returned. In 2016, Crystal River, the village of and the businesses of, realized that that's the lifeblood of their community. That's the health of their community. That's the source of the economy of their town. People come from all over the world to see the manatees. They needed to protect the water. So they started to create laws about over-fertilization. They started to replant grasses that had been killed by the overabundance of invasive algae. I was there a month ago and I see improvement. I have hope. I have hope for a place like that. What that tells me, and should tell you also, is that given the application of scientifically proven restoration efforts, we can do this. We can turn this around. But it's going to take money, and it's going to take politicians agreeing to give the money. It's going to take people willing to help and cooperate. On the other hand, if I've been to springs pretty much untouched by urban development, they remain pretty much the same. Itchitucknee Springs is an example. Rainbow River Springs is another example. Those still look a lot like they did when I first entered the springs. But they're all being affected by, I would call it nitrate pollution, an overabundance of nitrates that comes from septic tanks, over-fertilization of farm fields and landscaping, over-pumping, and in some cases, gentlemen, sewage is spread out over the recharge areas of the springs, and that also adds a lot of nitrates. But these things are being, in some places, addressed. So, as I said, I don't want to be a prophet of doom. I want to be a prophet of optimism.
No, I really like how you said like that introduction of models, like people are trying to restore some of those places, springs. And, like for me, I always thought about it like in the sense that it has to take like 20, 40, 50 years to create that restoration process. But from the way that you're describing it, this could be even done earlier. The point is to start acting now and start taking care of our environment around us and sort of taking more of that challenge at this time and work with the communities and work with the wildlife around us. And we could see probably changes within like 5 years. It doesn't necessarily have to be a whole generation gap.
Exactly. Crystal River is an example of what's happened in 5 years. Believe me, it's far from what it was 40 years ago, but it's far better than it was 5 years ago. But also you have to consider that every spring has a different time between when the rain goes into the aquifer and when it comes out as springs. Some of the submarine springs that are off the Atlantic coast, a few miles offshore, recently their water was tested, and that water that's coming out of there is over 10,000 years old. So if you're going to affect the nitrate level in a spring like that, that isn't happening for millennia. But in other springs, like Crystal River, where the recharge area is pretty much around the springs right there, I mean, that's an example of what can be done. So we have to have hope, but we need dedication. We need politicians to agree that we need to spend the money. Not everyone's going to be happy. Whenever you make change, someone's affected.
Yeah, you mentioned like some of the reasons why the pollution is there's like septic tanks, sewage. Is there anybody that's overwatching that? Do we have like stakeholders that are watching to preserve or to remove all that? Or is anyone held accountable for what's happening? And
Well,
why aren't
there should be, and there is in some cases. Every spring is in a water management district. And they've not always been good stewards of the springs. For several years, they've often gone the way of helping development and pumping of the aquifer for water bottling plants and stuff within the springs area. I'm seeing that change ever so slowly because we can vote those people out and vote people in who want to do more to protect these springs. Because guys, you got to remember that water that's coming out of the springs in many cases is the same water you're drinking and your children are drinking. And it's not about environmentalism. It's not about saving the planet. It's not about climate warming. It's about the quality of water that you put in your body every day and what that can do to you. And you need to fix that. And if you fix that, that will fix a lot of other things as well.
Would you mind discussing the role of agriculture specifically in regard to the degradation of water that we've been seeing? Because there are different conversations I've had with different people, it seems like there is the urban stuff like septic tanks, right, do have a issue, do cause an issue, right? But it seems that overwhelmingly that agriculture, specifically nitrogen, phosphorus, is the largest kind of contributor to that degradation. What are your thoughts on that?
Could you rephrase that for me, please?
Would you mind discussing the role that agriculture specifically has in
Agriculture?
agriculture?
Agriculture is one of the probably going to be the most difficult obstacle because that's people's living and it's been their living historically. And if you want to raise food, you need to fertilize the fields. And I can't blame those people who own that land and who need to make a living from the land. Why should they sacrifice themselves for something that's somewhat ambiguous, that's going to give them an ambiguous return? They have to make a living. An option is, and it's happening in some places, that the state and counties are buying land to protect the recharge area. Perhaps it'd be simpler to change a soybean field to a pasture that doesn't need fertilization. There are answers, but I think if you're going to really protect the aquifer and the nitrates from ag fields, you're going to have to buy that land or help subsidize the farmers perhaps who own that land. And I'll say it again, it's the water that you depend on that is the end story. And another thing might be to as I said, buy up all that land if you can, but you can't treat the water once it's gone into the ground. It's too late. It's going to come back in the springs. It's going to come back in the wells. So, and a lot of agricultural nitrates comes from human sewage that's treated and dried and spread on the fields. And that not only contains nitrates, but pharmaceuticals, and in some cases, heavy metals. And we are what we drink, gentlemen.
Yeah, I hear this is not just happening like even in the US, we're talking worldwide, like South America. Some cases where pharmaceutical companies, they throw all those I guess all the antigens or whatever medicines that they have into the river systems. Kids come in, they go and jump into the river, shower, and then they start having the illnesses and disease. I guess my question here is, at a global level scale, when we're having issues like what's going on with Florida, the pollution of all that, other countries having the same issues, what does that mean, like at a global scale? Like, does that have an impact? Do all the water systems somehow come in together at the end and sort of, mix what's going on in one country to another, or what happens? I'm a bit uncertain at that point.
No, Florida is not connected to much else but North Florida, Alabama, and Georgia. Those three states are really the limestone aquifer that is the source of the springs. I would say what's happening in Florida can be an example for the world and what can be done to alleviate things like nitrate overproduction and nitrate restriction, fertilizer restriction. It's really that's really what it comes down to, is nitrates and overpumping. Florida has had a interest in looking at development and water bottling plants as a priority over the environment. That's old. It's been like that for a long time. And it's understandable because, frankly, I don't think anybody really saw this coming like they do now. I saw it coming a long time ago just because in my experience of studying biology, I've seen very rare cases where things got better. Have you? Have you seen many examples where things have got better? No. And I didn't see it happening in the spring. So that's why I decided long ago I need to document this place because someday we may lose it. And frankly, in some cases, we are losing it now.
So describe this issue of overpumping a little bit more, right? So we discussed the phosphorus issue, right? But overpumping also leads to increasing salinity levels in Florida Springs. Discuss that issue a little bit.
Overpumping lowers the amount of water in the aquifer. So what happens is, and that's done by water bottling plants, that's done by cities pumping water for their citizens. It's done by agriculture pumping water to irrigate their fields. So when you lower the pressure in the aquifer, what you're doing is creating less pressure for the springs to come out of the ground. And when that happens, you get decreased flow. And like in Crystal River, the flow is roughly half of what it used to be 40 years ago. So you don't get the flushing effect of pushing out bad things. There isn't as much clean, fresh water coming up. Also near the coast, when you start to suck the fresh water up in the aquifer, that pulls in the salt water from the coastlines. You get that in your city wells and you're done. That well's no longer any good. So overpumping is an issue, and it just decreases spring flow and volume, and that's has its ramifications.
And as a result of these two issues, right? Given your 45 years of experience in these Florida Springs, what changes in species composition have you seen over time?
Oh
have you?
boy,
Yeah, by all means.
yeah, I can talk to that. When I was first starting to shoot film underwater in the springs of Florida, I saw a few exotics. Once in a while, you would see an aquarium fish in there, and he probably didn't last long because somebody ate him. And then I saw in Silver Glen Springs, for example, tilapia. Now, tilapia are not a native species. They're from Africa. They were accidentally introduced a long time ago, and they are taking over a lot of springs. You can't catch them by hook and line. It's very hard to do it by hook and line. So they have virtually no enemies. When they're small, things eat them, but they're prolific breeders. And I have images of them building nests 3 feet across, big basins in the sand bottoms. They lay their eggs. The male comes up. When the eggs hatch and the fry are in trouble, he opens his mouth and they go inside of his mouth. So they have a very distinct way of protecting their young, and they just reproduce exponentially. One of the greatest, newest threats that I've seen is the South American fish called the Plecostomus. Are you familiar with that critter? You've probably seen him.
I have him in my aquarium.
Yeah, well, don't let it go.
Wait,
Yeah,
I have a Pleco. I didn't realize there were nuisance with that level.
They're from South America.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay.
They
that
are
makes sense.
taking
Okay.
over as the dominant species in several springs. They have no natural enemies. They burrow into the side of spring runs and rivers and create shore erosion. And they're armored catfish. There aren't many things that want to eat them. And just by their presence and by the presence of tilapia, those are the two biggest invaders of the springs that I've seen over the years, and they're taking over. And silver springs are the dominant species now, and tilapia and Plecostomus. Whereas before, if I went to Silver Springs, I saw a great variety of species, and I still do, but not as many. Kind of like the python in the Everglades. Got a slow start, but it's creeping and creeping and creeping. And I don't know what to do about that. I'm not aware of any efforts to eliminate them, because you can't really poison a whole spring to kill off a few residents that you don't want. So that's something for the for the biologists, Florida biologists, to resolve. May never be resolved.
So discuss the absence of certain species. So, for example, manatees have been big in the news lately. We recently lost over 1,000 of 6,000 of our resident manatee species. Well, there are a lot more when you were kind of exploring earlier, how has that changed?
Well, I saw a lot more. I saw a lot more of everything, and a lot of it was because they weren't used as much. We have loved a lot of springs to death. There's one spring in particular called Gilchrist Blue. It's now Gilchrist Blue State Park. In the 70s and 80s, I could go in that spring and I could see all sorts of things. Now it's so heavily used that it's basically just a barren sand bowl. And I shot a lot of film for my book in that spring. I was in that spring day and night, all seasons of the year. I go there now and it's pretty barren. So hopefully that will come back now that it's a state park and it'll be left alone. You see, I think nature has a way of replenishing itself if we let it. If we remove the obstacles to positive change, I think nature will come back, but we have to be diligent about that.
During your time working in the springs, did you see any extinct fish during that time frame? Maybe during the first early expeditions down to the springs that were there, but then years later you didn't see that species anymore?
Well, that's a good question. Offhand, I would have to say no. What I have seen, however, are fewer of what I used to see. And here's another example in Crystal River. I could go in the head springs, I'd see 1,000 mullet. I'd see hundreds of snapper. I would see tarpon, snook, occasional bull shark had come through. This is a mix of freshwater and the sea. It's a wondrous place to see. That's gone. I was there a few weeks ago. I dove that spring. There was 30 or 40 snappers in there and half a dozen snook. That was all. It's just still in bad shape. It does not have the clarity and the water volume that it used to. But I give the people of Crystal River credit. They're working on it. I can see change coming that will be helpful.
What's your opinion on people? A lot of people visit on a yearly basis those springs. Do you think they should be private at this time, or should they still let tourist people just come in and enjoy the springs, just to mitigate some of those effects, I guess, pollution and so forth?
Well, people in of themselves don't pollute by being in a spring.
Okay.
I think people exposed to the springs are the best advocates for the springs. If you walk up to a spring and you look at it, gentlemen, it's a beautiful thing, but you don't know what's going on underneath unless you get in the water. And when you get in the water, that's when the amazing part of the springs hits you. So I encourage people to go in the springs. I encourage them to do it wisely, however, and there are ways to do it wisely. And those ways are often posted at the spring. So, and it's also like the manatees. There's been a controversy for 40 years whether or not people should be allowed to encounter manatees in the wild. And Crystal River is where that happens. That's really about the only place in the world where you can go in the water and physically be amongst a manatee. Manatees, and I've seen this time and time again, if you don't go up to them, they'll come up to you. They're not afraid of you if you don't harass them. I've had babies come up to me and roll over and want to be petted. People, if that happens to people, there's no better manatee advocate than a person that's encountered a wild manatee. I call those manatees ambassadors of their species. They do more to give themselves press and word of mouth than any brochure, film, government publication, anything. A personal encounter, it can be a life-changing event for people.
Well, a question I have now that we're talking a lot about springs, what is your favorite spring to visit?
That's not a fair question. There there are so many different kinds. You see, that's the beauty of those places. I think if a person who wants to, and here's two things. If you're in the water, I would say if you want to go in the water with a mask and snorkel or even scuba gear, I would recommend drifting the Rainbow River. You go up to the head springs, they'll let you off in the water and you can drift down for a few miles. It's a marvelous adventure. You see a lot of amazing things. If you're a snorkeler, you can do that too. If you're not aquatic minded, if you don't want to get wet, I think Silver Springs is a great place because they have glass bottom boats. And then you get an idea of what it's like there. Also, Ginny Springs is an interesting place for scuba divers. It's overrun. It's way too busy. It's a private spring. It's not well monitored for quality of experience, but the cavern there is an interesting experience for a scuba diver to get an idea of actually where that spring water comes from. All these springs have a cave in them of one dimension.
Oops, sorry about that.
That's okay. I'm getting beeped here too once in a while, but so yeah, and, there's, I think one of the most beautiful little springs I've ever been is Crystal Springs Cypress Springs in the Panhandle. I've found some pottery sherds there from ancient Floridians who lived next to that spring. So, and it's got a beautiful cave system filled with fish. And, but I would just go to any spring close to you. Blue Springs State Park in Volusia County gives you an opportunity to see manatees from the surface, and you can snorkel it and see the immense cave where the water just comes literally right out of the ground, right in your face.
All right. Thank you for sharing that. I'll definitely be going to some of those now that I have like an idea of what to expect. Vasilios?
I just think it's funny that you mentioned Rainbow River. I was literally there last Sunday, so a couple of days ago, and it was just absolutely gorgeous, And,
yeah, isn't it?
I mean, it's just, I mean, it's breathtaking. And I think the important thing that people need to realize is that our spring system is so unique. It's really the equivalent of like the Amazon or any of these kind of major other ecosystems that kind of exist. It's like, nothing in the world competes with what we have here in Florida. And
absolutely. I've worked in the Amazon. I've been months in the Amazon, and it's a fascinating place. But if I had my choice, I'd spend it in the Florida Springs. They're as unique. They're just rare environments in the whole world, gentlemen.
Absolutely. And kind of going off a little bit of what we've generally been talking about, would you mind kind of discussing kind of your photography throughout the years a little bit, right? So is there anything, so I mean, how have you as a photographer changed in terms of technique or anything else as you've kind of been exploring these springs?
Well, I got my first experience with underwater photography in the northern lakes of the upper Midwest. And the thing I learned there is that if you want to photograph wildlife underwater, and that's what you are, you're basically a wildlife photographer. The thing to do is to not approach them, but so many things in the aquatic world are curious and they'll come to you. So that was something I learned, and I applied that in the springs. But I did a lot of things at night in the springs. A lot of things change after dark. Different animals come out, other animals go to sleep, and that always requires a flash and different lenses. But I'm down to a GoPro now. I had several Nikonos cameras, but I'm down to a GoPro. I like the options that provides me, and but I would recommend anybody that gets in the water, patience is a virtue in underwater photography. Approach things slowly, let them come to you sometimes, and it just creates wonderful memories if you can bring home some of your experiences.
So, and kind of circling back to another issue we kind of discussed, right? How can we as individuals help improve the springs, right? Not only when we're there, right, but through our habits at home or through anywhere else.
What can we do to help the springs is your question?
Yeah, as individuals.
As personal people in our society?
Yes.
There's a couple of things, and I try to do them. Number one is you can join and support organizations that do research on springs. The best one, I think, is the Florida Springs Institute. It's in High Springs, Florida. It's run by Dr. Robert Knight. He's a very wise, experienced researcher scientist who has the best handle on what's happening in the springs than anybody else in the state of Florida. His Florida Springs Institute puts out monthly bulletins. They tell you what's going on, and they can tell you how to help by writing a politician or watching who's going to be voted in that's a spring advocate. And that's the one thing you can do. The other thing is vote. If you think the priority of your environment is more than something else, vote that way. If you have a local spring that's near you, that, for example, if you live near the Ichitucknee Springs, there's an organization for that. There's groups, social media groups you can join. Spring Hunters, Aquafarius, Ichitucknee Springs Alliance. That's the one good thing about the new world we live in that was not around when I first started to work on my Springs book, is that my book was the only thing I could offer. There was nothing else out there in those days. I think books are kind of going the way of the dinosaur, but they still can help in some cases. But social media, getting online, being a member of Spring Advocates is the thing to do today, and vote.
Given the fact that this interview was possible because we were both mutually part of that Facebook group, Aquafarius, I think that kind of holds a lot of testament to that, right? It's like through our ability to kind of connect with different individuals across the world and across the state to kind of build this coalition. So I definitely think there's a lot of power in social media and through our kind of increasingly connected world.
Yeah, that's the future, gentlemen. That's the future, I think.
Absolutely.
I want to talk a little bit maybe about the algae, red algae, the bloom. Can you tell us a little bit about that, and how are the springs, are they being affected, or what other sea portions in our areas are being affected by that?
You've probably heard about the manatee die-offs in 2021 up in the Indian River Lagoon, where we've lost a record number of manatees this year to starvation. Well, the reason the manatees starved off is because of algae pollution. Fed by nitrates from the groundwater of surrounding areas, the nitrates are essentially just pouring fertilizer in the water that creates algae blooms. And then what happens is you get the water so thick with algae that it cuts off light. And then what happened was all of the seagrasses that those manatees depended upon to live died. They got shaded out. And the Indian River Lagoon is a historic wintering area also. And those manatees went there and there was no food for them because the nitrates over fertilized the Indian River Lagoon, created algae blooms that killed their food. So they're starving to death because of the algae basically cutting off the sunlight. That happened in Crystal River. Same thing. And there's another algae that's takes over. It grows like black mats on the bottom, covers up the ecosystem on the bottom, and doesn't allow eelgrass to grow. So what algae essentially does is that it cuts off light, and light is something springs need to thrive. Light creates photosynthesis, and light creates Vallisneria, the species of eelgrass that is required by manatees and a lot of life. So it's the basis of the food chain. You cut off the basis of the food chain, everything above that suffers.
My question: when big events such as this happen, like the algae boom, or when we're talking about fertilizers just going into the systems, is anyone ever held accountable? And if so, who do they point the finger to? And have they ever won a case and actually do like effective lawsuits against major corporations, or nobody takes the fault and just move on? They move on.
So far, I can't say there's been a whole lot of repercussions for the reasons of the manatee die-offs. It's because it's not just one thing. It's those nitrates came from lots of sources: runoff from rain, runoff from agricultural fields, over-fertilization of lawns by landscaping, septic tanks that are old and leaking. And so there's a lot of culprits, and it's hard to really say, hey, you're the reason this is happening. What is hopefully happening now, and it's happening in Tallahassee, for example, where Bucala Springs was overrun with algae, is that they're actually passing laws now that you cannot put water into the aquifer unless it's been treated in some fashion. You have to restrict the amount of fertilizer you can use on your lawn. You can only fertilize your lawn at a certain time of the year. All of these are abatement measures. But as for repercussions, there's probably just too many villains in the story to go after them all. So what has to happen is fundamental change in the water laws.
Water laws. Okay. Do you have questions, Adolfo? No.
So I think that's it in terms of questions for me, and it seems like in terms of Adolfo too. I guess the best way to finish this interview off is, what message do you have for the people listening? Why should you care about this issue, and just kind of anything else you want to say.
I think one of the reasons you should care about this issue is because this is an environment unlike any other in the world. It is rare, it is special, and if that isn't enough reason, consider it's an environment that provides you the water that you drink. And if you don't care about the water you drink, you have a serious problem. So if you can't help that, then we're lost. You have to care about your own children, your own community. And if you do that, you'll also care about the springs. So the springs will benefit from you being concerned about, about your water, if for no other reason. If you don't even care about biology, care about your health. Over nitrates, bad for pregnant women, creates a lot of problems. So that's the thing. And if I could add one thing, I don't know if you've spoken to Dr. Robert Knight of the Florida Springs Institute.
No, not
Please
yet.
do. Please do. There's no better authority, information source, or reference than Dr. Knight.
Absolutely. Thank you for the recommendation. I'll definitely be sure to reach out to him as soon as we finish.
Yes, please do. Tell him I said hello.
Absolutely.
Definitely. Well, with that said, I think this concludes the interview. But once again, we want to thank you for making some time today, discussing some of the work you've done throughout the years. Are there any plans in the future of doing any future books that you're trying to write, or more photography in the nearby future?
I'm glad you asked that question. I'm presently in negotiation with my book publisher now about the feasibility of a fourth edition. They asked me if I want, this book's been around for 30 years. It's a field guide. I don't know if you've seen it, but it's kind of a field guide and an information source on why the springs exist and what lives in them. And a fourth edition has to be changed a lot because the springs have changed a lot. A lot of the images I have in that book, and it's mostly a book of photography that shows you what's there and why. A lot of those images don't apply anymore because the water's changed. The water's dirty. The water's different. The animals aren't there. So a fourth edition is going to have to reflect those changes. And hopefully, I just wanted to create awareness a long time ago about these amazing places. I just thought the world should know them better. I made the book, and now I just hope I can still do that. In a fourth edition, I can show what's happening. I can show you before and after, and maybe some long day when I'm gone, I've made some difference. That's my wish.
Absolutely, and please keep us updated on whether that goes through. I'm sure the Lower History program would love to pick up a copy and have it as part of our collection. And thank you for the work that you've done over the last 45 years to document such an important ecosystem.
Yeah.
I appreciate it.
I do have a final question, I suppose. Sorry, I'm just thinking right now. I was reading some of the work you've done as well. You've worked with the Field Museum, Chicago Field Museum. You've worked with, you traveled to Peru, done different expeditions. Yeah, and we would like to maybe hear what have been your experiences when doing those expeditions and traveling around.
Well, I went to Peru with the Chicago Field Museum on an expedition to find new species of fishes. Because there are areas where the water is clear enough, I took all of my underwater gear, my photo gear, no scuba tanks, but my photo gear and my snorkel gear and my wetsuits, and going over the Andes in the back of a truck, all of that stuff was stolen. So I ended up with hardly anything after that. So we ended up spending a few weeks in a place tourists don't go, way back up where the people have little contact with the outside world. And the Field Museum has a historic relationship with Peru, and this was one of their outposts. But it didn't work out well. We did get some work done, but I'm afraid the natives didn't appreciate our presence. They thought collecting things was to their detriment. So they basically took us and grabbed us and took us away. And
Thanks.
So I'm lucky I'm here, gentlemen.
But I think that's very important, though, to understand like the cultural aspect of it and what it means to other groups of people, like being in those lands, and the preservation and the importance that it means to them, even just making anybody outside of those realms coming in, they're trying to be protective in their own way. So I don't know, it's just very,
I was just going to say, it was in our interest to help them. We were there to try to find things that were still there that may not be there as development comes into the third world. So, but there are a lot of political forces in the world, as you might know, and there were political forces in Peru at the time that didn't like gringos and didn't want Americans and did everything in their power to undermine what we were doing and create conflict. So we were a victim of that. I think the people themselves were innocent enough. They were just told things that weren't true. They were told I lived underwater during the day and came out at night and stole their children. Now, that's hard to argue with because I wasn't doing that, but someone made them believe it. So it's funny now, but not if they got a machete to your throat. So that's the hazard of going that far in, I guess. But I wouldn't trade it for the world now because it was quite the experience. And we did find some new species and got a chance to meet some people with a far distant perspective than us. You and I can look each other in the eye and we're from the same world. Sit down at a table and look at someone from the Stone Age. That's a different thing. And
wow.
Absolutely. Well, I think that concludes this interview. Like again, thank you for your time, Captain Stamm. We appreciate it. And as soon as this interview is uploaded on our YouTube channel, I'll be sure to send you a link.
All right.
Just so for access to it as well. You know.
Pleasure was mine, gentlemen. Thank you for the time.
Thank you very much.
Have a good day. Thank you.
Have a great
All right.
time, great day, great week.
Thank you.
Okay.
All right. Good luck,
We'll
guys.
stay in touch.
So long.
All right.